Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. As he stared at the pile of medical equipment he would have to leave behind, Gizzo couldn't help but curse silently. Why couldn't those humans understand that proper medicine required the appropriate tools? Yet all they told him, when he complained, was that the place he was about to be deployed to wasn't a top-tier galactic hospital, but just a medical tent where wounded human soldiers needed help after a tough battle. The neural tissue regenerator sat mockingly on his cabin's medical bench. Beside it, the molecular suture array seemed to gleam with reproach. The bioscanner, the nano-injection system, the sterile field, all of it would remain here, in his ship, useless to the wounded who needed care. He turned to the mirror mounted on his cabin wall, adjusting his medical uniform as someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But never like this. Never so naked. The reflection that stared back at him was one of a seasoned Zalarian doctor, though he hardly felt seasoned facing this particular challenge. His skin was the color of autumn wheat, that distinctive yellow gold that marked his species, smooth and unblemished despite his 43 standard years. His pointed ears, each one nearly 15 centimeters from base to tip, were tense with suppressed agitation. His eyes dominated his face, two black orbs, lacking visible pupils or irises, just an endless black that seemed to swallow light. "Naked," he muttered to himself, adjusting the collar of his medical uniform one final time. "Absolutely naked from a professional standpoint. I might as well be performing surgery with stone knives and prayer beads." The airlock notification chimed, a soft three-note melody that indicated it was time to transfer to the human vessel. Gizzo took one last look around his medical cabin, at the equipment he'd spent years mastering, at the tools that represented the pinnacle of galactic medical science. Then he picked up his pathetic first aid case and walked away from civilization. The airlock opened silently. The pressure equalized with a soft pop he felt in his sensitive ears. He stepped through the threshold of his personal medical vessel. The ship's AI chirped a farewell in his native language, wishing him success in his mission. He didn't respond. What was there to say? Success in this context meant keeping humans alive with equipment that belonged in a historical exhibit. The transition tube between his ship and the human vessel stretched before him like a throat, waiting to swallow him whole. The contrast was immediately apparent. Where his ship's corridors were smooth, organic curves, the human transfer tube was all harsh angles and utilitarian grey metal. The transfer was quick, and soon the human's ship's interior assaulted his senses. Where Zalarian vessels employed careful environmental control, the human military transport was aggressively utilitarian. The corridors were wider than necessary, he noticed, with reinforced blast doors every 20 meters. The lighting was harsh white LED, and everything was painted in shades of grey and olive drab. As he entered the designated assembly area, Gizzo found he wasn't alone in his misgivings. 3 other medical professionals stood in various states of unease, each clutching their own pathetically small medical cases like life preservers in an ocean of uncertainty. The first was Dr. Throck, a Gamoran whose appearance would remind humans of their mythological trolls, though Gizzo knew better than to make such comparisons aloud. Beside Throck stood Dr. Prilix, whose species, the Amphros, had evolved on a swamp world of constant rain and high humidity. Her skin glistened with the moisture secretion that kept her breathing membranes functional, creating an almost jewel-like effect as the harsh lights caught the tiny droplets. The third volunteer was Dr. Catheta, an aviary whose presence seemed to make the grey room brighter. Her plumage was a work of art. Primary feathers in deep blue, secondary feathers in metallic gold, with highlights of purple and green that shifted with every movement. Before any of them could voice their concerns, the assembly room doors slid open with military precision. A human entered, Ambassador Daniel Wilson, according to the briefing materials. "Doctors," Ambassador Wilson began, his voice loud enough to be heard everywhere in the room. "I cannot express how much your presence means to us. The Terran Alliance is deeply grateful to the Galactic Council for honoring our mutual assistance pact. He paused, his gaze moving across each of them with an intensity that made Gizzo's ears tense. You are the 38th volunteer medical group to answer our call. 38. Each group before you has saved lives that would have been lost without your help. Your willingness to come here, to leave your advanced facilities and work in our austere conditions, speaks volumes about your character and your commitment to the medical oath we all share. Throck's gravelly voice rumbled through the room like distant thunder. We are medical professionals, Ambassador. Our duty transcends comfort or convenience. Though I must ask, why do your people insist on such primitive conditions? Surely the Alliance has access to better equipment? Wilson's smile was tired and knowing. What seems primitive to you has kept humanity alive through centuries of conflict, Doctor. We need first aid more than anything else. Our medical technology may not regenerate tissue or knit bones, but it's quick, and speed means everything when you have a lot of wounded soldiers.
The briefing mentioned we would be deployed to a secured area, Catheta interjected. Can you confirm the combat situation?
Yes, Wilson nodded firmly. Let me be clear. You'll be deployed via drop pod directly to the medical staging area outside Arogar City. The Vetrax assault was repelled hours ago. Their forces have been completely eliminated from the city. There are no active combat operations in your deployment zone. Your only task will be treating the wounded who are waiting for care. The fighting is over. The relief that passed through the group was obvious. Prilix's throat sac deflated significantly, the rapid pattern slowing to a more normal rhythm. Catheta's feathers smoothed against her body. Even Gizzo felt his own ears relax from their flattened position, swiveling forward again to better catch sounds. If you'll follow me, Ambassador Wilson said, gesturing toward the exit. I'll escort you to the drop pod. We'll brief you on the specific conditions as we walk. The group fell into step behind him, their disparate gaits creating an odd polyrhythm in the metal corridor. The human ambassador led them through corridors that all looked the same. Grey walls, grey floor, grey ceiling, broken only by color-coded pipes and emergency equipment stations.
Ambassador, Catheta's voice chimed. Might I inquire about the nature of the injuries we'll be treating? My briefing mentioned human combat medicine differs significantly from Council standards, but was regrettably light on specifics.
Wilson's pace didn't slow, but Gizzo caught the slight tensing of his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward his side, checking for a weapon that wasn't there. A soldier's habit. Human soldiers are tough, as are our Deathwolder allies, the Thraxians, Wolverines, and others who fight alongside us. The injuries you'll see will be primarily physical trauma, projectile wounds from kinetic weapons, plasma burns, blast injuries from explosives, blunt force trauma from hand-to-hand combat. Nothing your training hasn't prepared you for.
And the medical facilities? Dr. Prilix asked. The briefing mentioned field hospitals, but was frustratingly non-specific about the actual equipment and conditions we'll be working with.
The medical tent is fully functional, Wilson assured them, though Gizzo noticed he didn't meet their eyes when he said it. It may not be what you're used to. We don't have molecular healers or tissue regenerators, but human field medicine has kept our soldiers alive through conflicts that would have exterminated most species. You'll be working alongside human medical personnel, who have generations of experience with our methods. They'll guide you through our procedures. Finally, they reached a heavily reinforced chamber that seemed like their destination. The doors were twice as thick as any they'd passed, with warning labels in a dozen languages proclaiming danger. Authorized personnel only, and drop pod bay. In the chamber's center sat a drop pod that looked less like a medical transport and more like a weapon. A brutal cylinder of ablative armor and heat shielding, with only a few small viewports breaking its intimidating surface. Crash couches arranged in a circle around a central equipment column, each one showing the wear of hard use. Dr. Throck's bass rumble voiced what they were all thinking.
This is safe? It looks like a projectile more than a transport.
Ambassador Wilson actually smiled, though it was a hard expression that didn't reach his eyes. That's because it is a projectile, Doctor. This pod is designed to punch through contested airspace and deliver troops to a hot landing zone under enemy fire. It can survive direct hits from plasma weapons, penetrate aerial defense grids, and land intact in almost any condition short of a direct nuclear strike. For a peaceful descent to a secured area, it's actually overkill. Think of it as insurance.
Comforting,
Gizzo muttered, his ears flattening against his skull as he examined the pod more closely. They filed into the pod one by one, each having to duck through the human-sized hatch. The interior was even more Spartan than the exterior suggested. Bare metal walls with only minimal padding, crash couches that had been hastily modified with extenders and adjustable components to accommodate non-human physiologies. Gizzo found a couch that looked like it might fit his anatomy and settled in, securing his medical case in a compartment that had probably once held ammunition. Ambassador Wilson entered last, sealing the hatch with a solid thunk that reverberated through the hull like a funeral bell. The internal lights switched to red emergency illumination, casting everything in a bloody glow that did nothing for Gizzo's nerves. "I'll be accompanying you to the surface," Wilson explained, strapping himself into his couch. "Help with the acclimation process. Introduce you to the chief medical officer. Make sure you have everything you need to get started. Now then," he continued, his fingers interacting with a control panel with rapid movements. "The descent will take approximately 12 minutes. There will be some turbulence as we hit atmosphere. The pod's designed for speed, not comfort. The inertial dampeners will handle the worst of it, but you'll still feel about 3 Gs during the main burn. I recommend you secure your straps properly. The 5-point harness might seem excessive, but trust me, you'll want it." Gizzo fumbled with the harness system, clearly designed for human anatomy, but functional enough for most bipedal species. "Launching in 30 seconds, Wilson announced. "Just breathe normally and try to relax. Remember, this pod has successfully delivered troops to combat zones over 10 times. A milk run to a secured LZ is nothing." The pod shuddered as magnetic clamps released their grip. There was a moment of weightlessness that made Gizzo's stomach lurch. Then the main engines fired. The acceleration hit like a giant's fist, pressing them into their couches with brutal force. This wasn't the smooth, dampened thrust of civilized vessels. This was raw, primitive propulsion that cared nothing for passenger comfort. Gizzo's medical knowledge unhelpfully informed him that his internal organs were experiencing compression that would cause permanent damage to weaker species. The turbulence hit moments later as they entered the planet's atmosphere. Wilson had called it some turbulence, but that was clearly a human definition written by someone with a death wish. The pod bucked and rolled like a wild animal, the hull screaming as friction heated the ablative armor to temperatures that would melt most metals. Gizzo could hear Prillix's distressed croaking, a sound that awakened primitive fear responses in his brain, the cry of prey in distress. The heat came next, radiating through the hull despite the insulation. The internal temperature climbed rapidly, 40 degrees, 42, 43. Gizzo's knowledge of physics told him this was normal, that the ablative armor was doing its job by burning away in controlled layers. His survival instincts told him he was trapped in a metal coffin that was currently on fire. The pod's frame groaned and popped as different materials expanded at different rates. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the chaos began to subside. The pod's descent smoothed as they entered thicker atmosphere, and the control surfaces became effective. Gizzo could feel the braking thrusters firing in sequence, sharp jolts that would have been gentle nudges in a proper transport, but felt like kicks from an angry mule in this military hardware. The temperature began to drop, though the hull still radiated heat like a furnace. The landing, when it came, was surprisingly gentle, a series of small impacts as landing struts absorbed their momentum, followed by a final settling that left them tilted at a slight angle. The engines cut out with a final wheeze, leaving them in relative silence, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the ragged breathing of 4 terrified medical professionals. "Welcome to Arrogar," Ambassador Wilson announced, already unbuckling his harness as if he hadn't just experienced the same descent into hell. "Take a moment to adjust to the gravity. It's about 1.2 standard, so you'll feel heavier than usual. The atmospheric composition is within acceptable ranges for all your species, though the oxygen concentration is a bit high, at 23%. You might feel lightheaded at first." The hatch cycled open in a single motion. The natural light flooded in along with a wave of alien air. The smell hit Gizzo first, a complex assault of unfamiliar scents that his brain struggled to categorize. The metallic tang of blood, both human and alien, underlying everything, and beneath it all, the ineffable smell of war. Fear sweat, cordite, death, and desperate hope mixed into something that made his medical instincts simultaneously recoil and engage. "Whenever you're ready," Wilson said, standing by the hatch with the easy balance of someone accustomed to variable gravity. "No rush. Take whatever time you need to acclimate. The wounded have waited this long. A few more minutes won't matter." One by one, they emerged from the pod. Gizzo unbuckled slowly, testing his weight against the increased gravity. His legs, evolved for the lighter gravity of Zellar, protested at the additional load. His spine compressed slightly, and he could feel his heart working harder to pump blood to his brain. But it was manageable, uncomfortable, but not debilitating. The scene that greeted them as they stepped onto the planet's surface was unlike anything in Gizzo's medical experience. They had landed in what might generously be called a field hospital staging area, though it bore no resemblance to any medical facility he had ever seen or trained in. The landing pad was just a cleared area of dirt, marked by the scorched marks of previous pod landings. Around it, the aftermath of battle was everywhere. Rows of wounded beings, humans and their Deathwelder allies, stretched in rough lines across muddy ground that had been churned into a morass by thousands of boots and tracks of military vehicles. Some wounded sat on improvised benches, made from ammunition crates and salvaged metal. Others lay on military-issue sleeping bags, spread directly on the dirt, their faces pale with blood loss or flushed with fever. There was no organization that Gizzo could recognize, no clear triage areas, no separate zones for different types of injuries, no isolation for infectious cases, just row upon row of damaged bodies, waiting for help. The battlefield's detritus surrounded them like the shed skin of some massive beast. Scorched earth marked where plasma weapons had fired, leaving glass-smooth craters that still radiated heat. Pieces of destroyed vehicles littered the periphery. The twisted remains of hover tanks, the skeletal frames of aircraft brought down by ground fire, even what looked like part of a Vetrax war machine, its biomechanical components rotting in the alien sun. Buildings that had once been part of Arrogar's city's suburbs were now rubble, their remains pushed into rough barriers that provided minimal shelter from the elements. The medical tent itself dominated the center of the area like a canvas cathedral, a massive olive-colored military structure that must have been 40 meters long and 20 wide. Its sides bore the scars of recent battle, patches where shrapnel had torn through, burn marks from near misses with plasma weapons, even what looked like claw marks from something that had tried to get inside. But it was the wounded themselves that drew Gizzo's attention and held it with horrified fascination. Humans with field dressings wrapped around limbs, their uniforms torn and stained with blood and dirt. Their faces showed the exhaustion of combat, but their eyes held a desperate hope as they watched the new arrivals. "System is simple," Ambassador Wilson explained, his voice taking on a clinical tone that didn't quite mask his own exhaustion. "Red tags are already inside receiving immediate treatment. Traumatic amputations, arterial bleeding, tension pneumothorax, the injuries that will kill within minutes without intervention. Yellow tags, that's most of what you see here, are stable but need treatment within the next few hours. Deblacerations, fractures, burns, puncture wounds that aren't immediately life-threatening. Green tags are ambulatory. Minor injuries only. Cuts, bruises, minor burns, exhaustion cases. The surgeons inside will handle the critical cases. Your job will be to help clear this backlog. Sutures, setting bones, treating burns, administering antibiotics, clearing and dressing wounds. Nothing you haven't done 1,000 times before. 1,000 times with proper equipment, Dr. Throck rumbled, but there was no real protest in his voice. They were doctors. The wounded needed them. That fundamental truth transcended species, transcended technology, transcended comfort. The conditions are challenging, Wilson admitted, leading them through the waiting wounded. But every person here is alive because human field medicine works. It's not pretty. It's not sophisticated by your standards, but it keeps soldiers breathing long enough to reach better facilities. As they walked, Gizzo noticed several soldiers tracking their movement with eyes that held desperate hope mixed with uncertainty. These warriors had probably never seen aliens like them before. A yellow-skinned Zalarian, a massive troll-like Gamoran, a glistening amphibian Ampharos, and a brilliant feathered aviori. But they saw the medical insignia, understood that help had arrived, and that was enough to kindle hope in faces grey with pain and exhaustion. The smell grew worse as they approached the medical tent. It wasn't just blood and battle anymore. It was the sickly sweet scent of infection beginning to take hold. The acrid smell of cauterized flesh. The sharp tang of primitive chemical disinfectants. And underneath it all, the smell of human suffering. Bodies pushed beyond their limits. Wounds left too long without proper treatment. The biological chaos of trauma and the body's desperate attempts to heal itself. Gizzo's ears swiveled, picking up sounds that made his medical instincts scream. Wet breathing that spoke of fluid in lungs, the restless movements of fever, the barely suppressed groans of beings trying to be brave in the face of agony. Dr. Prillix's throat sac was working overtime now, pulsing rapidly as her species' equivalent of hyperventilation. The conditions! How do they maintain any sterility? The contamination must be... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. They do their best, Wilson replied carefully. Field medicine isn't about perfection. It's about keeping soldiers alive. Catheta clicked her beak thoughtfully, a sound like ceramic tapping against stone. The gravity is significant. It will impact our dexterity. Fine motor control will be compromised. How do your surgeons manage precision work under these conditions? Practice, Wilson said simply. Humans have been performing surgery under field conditions for centuries. We've learned to do it. You will too. They were passing through the waiting wounded now, close enough that Gizzo could see the injuries in detail. Burns that would have been instantly treated with cellular regenerators back home were covered in primitive gel dressings that did little more than prevent further contamination. Lacerations that should have been sealed with molecular sutures were held closed with chemical adhesive, and fabric strips that would leave terrible scars. Broken bones were splintered with actual pieces of metal and wrapped with bandages, the most primitive immobilization possible. Everything was a stopgap. A temporary measure designed to keep the patient alive rather than heal them properly. Barbaric, Prillix whispered, and Gizzo couldn't disagree. But even as the word left her mouth, he caught the eye of a young human soldier, probably no more than 20 standard years. The boy's left arm was wrapped in blood-stained bandages, the smell of infection already beginning to rise from the wound. His face was pale from blood loss, lips cracked from dehydration, eyes sunken with exhaustion. But when he saw Gizzo's medical insignia, his entire expression transformed. Hope bloomed across his features like sunrise after a long night. "Hey, Doc," the soldier called weakly, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. "Glad you could make it. We were starting to wonder if anyone else was coming." Gizzo found himself nodding, his professional instincts overriding his discomfort. "We're here to help, soldier. You'll be treated soon." The gratitude in the boy's eyes was almost painful to witness. "Thanks, Doc. Just thanks for coming. I know it's not what you're used to, but..."
We really need the help.
They had barely taken 10 more steps when Dr. Throck spoke, his voice uncharacteristically firm.
Enough acclamation. We're doctors, and these beings need treatment. Ambassador Wilson, please show us to the medical tent. We've seen enough to know what we're facing.
The others nodded in agreement, even Prilix straightening despite her obvious discomfort. They were medical professionals. Their personal feelings were secondary to their duty. Whatever conditions awaited them inside that tent, they would adapt. They would overcome. They would save lives. Ambassador Wilson led them toward the main medical tent, its entrance a simple flap of heavy canvas. As they approached, Gizzo tried to prepare himself mentally. He'd seen trauma before. The Zalarian Medical Corps wasn't sheltered from reality. He'd treated victims of industrial accidents, survivors of pirate attacks, even casualties from border skirmishes. But something about the crude conditions, the sheer number of wounded, the primitive treatment methods he'd observed, was building a knot of apprehension in his stomach that grew tighter with each step. "Remember," Wilson said as they reached the entrance, his hand pausing on the tent flap. "Human medicine may seem crude, but it works. Try to keep an open mind. What you're about to see has served millions of lives over the centuries." The apprehension grew with each heartbeat. Gizzo found his hands tightening on his medical case until the handle creaked under the pressure. His ears flattened against his skull, an involuntary response to stress that he couldn't control. What awaited them inside? How could medicine be practiced without the tools that defined modern healing? How could lives be saved with nothing more than primitive chemistry and manual skill? Ambassador Wilson pulled back the tent flap. "After you, doctors." They entered into a vision of medical hell. The assault on Gizzo's senses was immediate and overwhelming. The copper smell of blood was so thick he could taste it on his tongue, metallic and cloying. The human doctor was using a manual saw, an actual mechanical saw, to remove a mangled leg from a Terran Marine. The patient was conscious, biting down on a leather strap while assistants held him steady. Blood flowed freely from the amputation site, not contained by any field or absorbed by any smart material, but simply pouring onto the dirt floor that had already turned to mud from similar procedures. The floor was a nightmare of churned earth, blood, and tracks from boots that had carried in dirt from outside. Each step the medical staff took spread the contamination further. At another station, medics were literally gluing wounds closed, squeezing tubes of industrial-grade chemical adhesive directly onto gaping lacerations, pressing the edges together and holding them until the adhesive set. No cellular regeneration, no molecular bonding, just chemical glue applied to human flesh like they were repairing machinery. A Wolverine warrior was having shrapnel pulled from his torso with metal forceps, each piece dropping into a metal pan with a wet plink. No scanning, no precision extraction, just brutal, manual removal while the warrior bit down on his own belt to keep from screaming. "By the sacred pools," Prilix whispered, her enormous eyes dilating to their maximum extent in shock. She swayed on her feet, her moisture secretion increasing dramatically until she was practically dripping. Then, with a sound like a wet towel hitting the floor, she fainted. Her body collapsed into the muddy ground, adding to the contamination. Throck lasted 30 seconds longer. The massive Gamoran watched a human medic cauterize a wound with a heated metal plate, the smell of burning flesh adding a new dimension to the sensory assault. His face went from moss green to a sickly pale yellow, the Gamoran equivalent of shock.
This is not medicine."
Then 7 feet of Gamoran doctor toppled backward like a felled tree, shaking a shelf and causing several surgical instruments to rattle on their trays. Catheta remained standing but frozen, her head cocked at an unnatural angle as she stared at a human surgeon reaching into an open chest cavity with gloved but otherwise unaugmented hands, manually clamping off a bleeding artery. A thin, high keening sound emerged from her throat, and her wings spread slightly. Then her eyes rolled back, showing the white, nictitating membranes, and she pitched forward,
Her beak struck the muddy ground with an ugly crack that made Gizzo wince. "Oh, for fuck's sake!" one of the human surgeons exploded, not even looking up from his patient. "These are supposed to be our reinforcements. They can't even handle the sight of blood. We don't have time for this shite. We've got 300 wounded out there." Ambassador Wilson immediately stepped forward, positioning himself between the angry surgeon and the fallen aliens. "Dr. Morrison, please. They're not used to these conditions. They've never seen field medicine." "Then they're useless," Morrison snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated from stimulants. "We need hands, not tourists. If they can't handle it, get them out." Gizzo stood among his fallen colleagues, the last one standing. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee. His medical training was shouting that everything here was wrong. The contamination, the primitive tools, the brutal methodology. This violated every principle of modern medicine he'd spent decades learning. But then, his eyes found a wounded soldier on a nearby stretcher. A human, barely out of adolescence, with half his face burned away by plasma fire. The boy was conscious, one remaining eye fixed on the ceiling, tears cutting tracks through the dirt and blood on his face, waiting, enduring, trusting that someone would help him. And suddenly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking together, Gizzo understood. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't about perfect medicine or proper procedures. This was a battlefield surgery at its most raw, where the only metric that mattered was survival. The humans weren't wrong. They were just working with what they had, and what they had was keeping people alive against impossible odds. Gizzo stepped over Prillix's unconscious form and moved to help his fallen colleagues. "Dr. Prillix," he said firmly, "wake up. We have work to do." Her eyes fluttered open, still dilated with shock. "The conditions, the contamination—" "Is irrelevant," Gizzo said flatly. "We're not in a hospital. We're in a war zone. Every moment we waste on shock is a moment someone bleeds out." He moved to Throck next, using his medical knowledge to trigger the Gamoran's revival reflexes. "Dr. Throck, on your feet, now." The massive doctor groaned, his eyes focusing slowly. "The barbarity—" "Is keeping them alive," Gizzo interrupted. "If you can't handle it, leave. But if you call yourself a doctor, then get up and help these people." Finally, he reached Catheta, gently manipulating the nerve cluster at the base of her skull. The aviori's eyes snapped open, her head rotating to focus on him. I cannot." "Yes, you can," Gizzo said firmly. "We all can. We must." He stood, addressing all three of them as they struggled to their feet. "Listen to me. Yes, this is primitive. Yes, it's contaminated. Yes, it violates everything we've been taught. But look around you." He gestured at the rows of wounded. "Every one of these beings is alive because this system works. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but it works. We can stand here being shocked, or we can help. Choose." The three doctors looked at each other, shame and determination warring on their faces. Finally, Throck rumbled. "You're right. We are doctors. What do we do?" Gizzo turned to the human medical staff, raising his voice. "We're ready to help. Tell us what you need." Dr. Morrison looked up from his patient, surprise flickering across his exhausted features. "You serious?" "We doctors," Gizzo said simply. "Put us to work." Morrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Barnes, get over here and show these aliens how to use field antibiotics. We'll start them on simple wound closure, and work up from there." A human medic, her scrubs so stained the original color was unrecognizable, approached with an armload of supplies. "Right, listen up. Forget everything you know about sterile procedure. Out here, antibiotics are our best friend. Pump everyone full of broad-spectrum antimicrobials and hope for the best." She held up a tube of the chemical adhesive. "This is medical glue. It's not pretty, but it holds wounds closed until we can get them to a proper facility. The medical ships will handle real sutures, prosthetics, and limb regrowth later. Our job is to keep them stable for transport." The next hours were a blur of mistakes and learning. Gizzo's first attempt at using the chemical adhesive resulted in gluing his own fingers together. Prilix applied too much and had to cut away the excess with primitive scissors. Throk's massive hands, so precise with proper tools, struggled with the crude instruments. But slowly, painfully, they learned. The human medics guided them with a patience born of desperation. Gizzo learned to judge the amount of adhesive by sight, to apply pressure just long enough for it to set. He learned to ignore the contamination, to work around the primitive conditions, to focus only on the immediate goal: stop the bleeding, prevent infection, keep them alive. Hours blended together. The wounded kept coming. Humans, Thraxians, Wolverines, even a few species Gizzo didn't recognize. Each one was damaged, bleeding, hoping for help, and gradually the alien doctors found their rhythm. Night fell, though inside the tent it made little difference. The work continued under the harsh LED lights. Gizzo lost count of how many wounds he'd glued, how many injections he'd administered, how many lives he'd helped save with tools that belonged in a museum. Dawn came grey and unwelcome, visible through the tent's few windows. Still, they worked. The line of wounded seemed endless, but gradually, impossibly, it began to shrink. Red tags became yellow, yellow became green. The crisis pace slowed to merely urgent. By the time the sun set again, painting the tent in shades of gold and crimson, they were treating the last of the urgent cases. Gizzo found himself suturing a relatively minor laceration on a human corporal, his movements automatic after dozens of similar procedures. When the last patient was stabilized, when the immediate crisis had finally passed, the three alien doctors found themselves in a corner of the tent, exhausted beyond measure. They leaned against each other without thinking. Dr. Morrison approached, looking every bit as exhausted as they felt. The anger was gone from his features, replaced by something that might have been respect. "You did good," he said simply. "All of you. We couldn't have managed without the extra hands." "We did what was necessary," Gizzo replied, too tired for anything but truth. Morrison nodded. "That's all any of us can do out here." He paused, then added, "Thank you." As the human walked away, Gizzo reflected on the past day and a half. He'd violated every principle of proper medicine. He'd used tools and techniques that would horrify any civilized medical board. He worked in conditions that would have shut down any proper facility. And he'd helped save lives, hundreds of them. The soldier he sutured would have a scar, but he'd live to see his family again. The Thraxian whose arm he'd helped amputate would receive a prosthetic, then a new limb later. The Wolverine with the belly full of shrapnel would heal and fight again. They were all alive, because human field medicine, primitive as it was, worked when nothing else was available. "I need to sleep," Prilix murmured, her voice slurred with exhaustion. "And then a proper shower. And then, perhaps, a memory wipe." "Agreed," Throk rumbled. "Though, I think I understand them better now, the humans." Catheta clicked her beak softly. "We have much to report to the Medical Council. Our textbooks may need revision." Gizzo nodded, too tired to speak. All he wanted was to return to his ship, to sleep in his proper bed, to pretend for a few hours that he hadn't just spent 2 days practicing medicine with stone knives and chemical glue. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. Satisfaction. Pride, even. He'd faced the impossible, and he had learned. As the 3 alien doctors finally stood to leave, supporting each other on unsteady legs, Gizzo took one last look around the field hospital. It was still primitive, still contaminated, still everything his training said medicine shouldn't be. But it worked, and in the end, that was all that mattered.